I wanted to start this video off just sitting in my living room, which I've never really done before, to talk to you guys face to face and very, very honestly, which is that I just love Final Fantasy. It's my favorite franchise of all time, but in large part because of all the different forms it's managed to take. It's been some fantastic turn-based RPGs that sort of built the genre in general. It's been an MMO that's revolutionized the way people look at online gaming. It's done spin-offs from turn-based combat that's like tactical to things that are gigantic or chocobo racing. It's done so much. And that doesn't even count the fact that they've also managed to do Final Fantasy animes, Final Fantasy movies. It's really a series that's done everything, and to me, that's very, very impressive. But there's begun to be a bit of a battle that's been brewing among the old school fans versus the new fans. People saying that Final Fantasy is kind of dead. Now I want to talk about that. What kind of begun this conversation is that recently we passed the 20th anniversary of Final Fantasy X, which to me is still one of the best games of all time. But a lot of people were actually saying that this is the last perfect Final Fantasy game. People saying that we'll never get anything this high quality when it comes to storytelling, universe building, and characters from Square Enix ever again. But I feel like this is actually kind of highlighting the Final Fantasy problem. The idea that something has gone wrong with the series, that even though individual games are still great, something has managed to decay at the heart of this saga. But is that true? I want to talk about that. As a person that really has done everything from getting every master weapon, getting every achievement, conquering every trophy, I love this series. I've seen it all. Let's talk about the Final Fantasy problem. In order to properly discuss the legacy of Final Fantasy and some of its highs and lows, we need to begin at the beginning, the original Final Fantasy, which was released in December of 1987. Now, something I've always kind of believed is that part of the reason that Final Fantasy managed to grow to such explosive success is because each of the early games was just so fantastic. Final Fantasy I, Final Fantasy IV, Final Fantasy VII, each of these games was just so beloved and so centered on its own story and universe and themes. And part of this just comes down to the fact that it was pure desperation. A very strange and interesting aspect of this series is the fact that the developers have never been shy to basically tell us exactly how this magical saga came about. And it was by pure desperation. They've printed these books called the Ultimania that actually has developer notes talking about the struggles of making these gigantic digital universes believable and fun and fantastic. And I think that, especially with the early games, that love and that fear of failure definitely shines through. Games like Final Fantasy I, Final Fantasy IV, Final Fantasy VII, these had some very, very dedicated themes of loss, of paranoia, of just basically that just drive to succeed at any cost. But this is really just a slice of why these games managed to become so successful. I mean, if we're being perfectly clear, an average gamer doesn't care about how the stuff is made, they just want good games. And all of the early Final Fantasy games were absolute bangers, completely freaking blowing away the competition. I mean, a lot of people tried to topple Final Fantasy during their day. So many different companies attempted to straight up rip off or copy the success of Final Fantasy, making their own turn-based RPGs, even trying to stylize themselves after the menus or the art, and all of them completely ended in failure. And in large chunk because Final Fantasy was just so great. It managed to revolutionize the idea of these huge epic quests of a couple teenagers coming together to try and fight the infinite darkness of the universe. Final Fantasy seriously managed to revolutionize the genre, making it so each of their games was just so good, but also each game was just so different. In my opinion, a big reason why Final Fantasy managed to garner as much attention as it did right out of the gate is because each of them took place in their own version of this world. You can go straight from something like FF6, which has this mind-controlled woman who's like a super soldier forced into a mech suit and trying to play a part in this crazy chaotic war, to something like Final Fantasy IX, which has a more cutesy art style, but also manages to just be so incredibly evil in some of the violence it shows. A huge appeal of Final Fantasy from the very, very start was that every single game was incredibly high quality, but also just so disconnected. They had different magic, different summons, different ideas that were crammed into the deliciousness of what made them so great. But this started to decay over time. At the very start of Final Fantasy, I think that it was partially good because there wasn't a ton of spin-offs. It was totally possible from the very start to easily keep up with Final Fantasy. It was just Final Fantasy 1, 2, 3, bam, there's a couple games. Then you have Final Fantasy Tactics, a nice little taste. Now we have Crystal Chronicles, which was like this dungeon crawling co-op experience. Then we suddenly got Chocobo Racing. Like, a lot of these games, it felt like as it ramped up, as these sales just continued to expand and increase exponentially, Square Enix tried to figure out, okay, we're making so much profit, how do we manage to maximize the potential? How can we make more of these games? But back in the day, the spin-offs were just as good as the mainline series. Ask anybody who's ever played Final Fantasy Tactics. Those games are fantastic. Even the sequels to that, like Tactics and Tactics Advanced and Tactics Advanced A2, like these games are incredibly top-notch. They're incredibly filled with the same love, the same passion, and most importantly, the same focus. Now, I think that's part of the reason that people are so nostalgic for the classic Final Fantasy games is because they were so groundbreaking. I have a theory that everybody's favorite Final Fantasy is the one they played first. I started with FF7. That game, of course, is regarded by a lot of people to be the greatest game of all time, myself included, but let's just face it, part of the reason I'm just so nostalgic for it is because it was one of my first RPGs, getting a chance to experience the materia system, leveling up my magics, doing side quests. That game was just so freaking enormous that, as a kid, it seemed impossibly big. The fact that I had these discs with an entire world on it, of planets that I had to save, was incredibly impactful. To be completely honest, the reason this YouTube channel exists, the reason I decided to become DreamcastGuy and do all this, is because of Final Fantasy VII. That put me on the path where I started to treat video games as a more serious art form. But I feel like here is also when things decided to change. This is when the shift began to take place. At the dawn of the PlayStation 2, technology was much more advanced. We were able to start to see games that had full voice acting. We managed to see more games that had full-time cutscenes, more actual revolutionary stuff that managed to push the boundaries of not just video games, but art in general. And here's where things kind of started to hit the rocks, beginning with Final Fantasy XI. Okay, so I got my copy here of Final Fantasy XI off the shelves, including a bunch of the very, very fancy expansion packs. And I want to make it perfectly clear, I'm not hating on Final Fantasy XI, but I do feel like this is when we had a tone shift. As much as I loved these games, as much as I had some very, very good memories of me and my friends honestly playing this game just incredibly badly, I still think that I could appreciate what they were trying to obtain. But let's face facts, this was not a single-player experience. This did not have a typical dedicated story. It didn't have a centered protagonist. And because of it, I feel like this is when a lot of Final Fantasy fans started to say, what the heck is going on? What's coming next? Now, they did manage to bounce back and make a pretty good recovery with Final Fantasy XII. Final Fantasy XII is freaking top-notch. The story, the writing, the way that you have this interesting leveling system, the idea that you could actually program your party members through this system called gambits that let you essentially make the gameplay itself, making it so people that would heal or cast magic at particular points. Final Fantasy XII was just so far ahead of its time, and I also liked the idea that it wasn't just a customary turn-based combat system. Players moved around, you actually had to step out of gigantic flaming parts and stuff. I liked this change, but I feel like this is where it started to lose people. The gigantic exodus, though, was Final Fantasy XIII. When most people talk badly about Final Fantasy XIII, I feel like they're doing it just out of some toxic nostalgia. Like, the wait for Final Fantasy XIII, the development cycle was incredibly elongated, and when it finally came out, I think a lot of people were kind of just confused because it was something that felt like it was trying to play on the roots of Final Fantasy VII. It wanted to have a super soldier protagonist who's trying to stop this evil company, but the writing in it was incredibly clunky. Now, I am not saying this just purely from memories. I actually, at the beginning of quarantine, I played through Final Fantasy XIII again. This is actually Xbox footage. It's upscaled, it's nice, it's beautiful. Artistically, I think that Final Fantasy XIII did a lot right. But let's face facts, it lost the biggest chunk of fans because it stayed way too long. Final Fantasy XIII lost money initially, and so because of it, Square Enix tried to recoup their losses by doing not one, not two, but 3 separate Final Fantasy XIII games. Now, this series in general, as a trilogy, it got better over time. Each of the subsequent games managed to iron out a lot of the problems, but this whole idea of a contained universe, you could tell that they wanted to try and do something extremely different. Now, in the past, we've seen Final Fantasy sequels already. Obviously, there was things like Final Fantasy X and X-2 and Dirge of Cerberus, which was a direct sequel to Final Fantasy VII. We even had things like the prequel, Crisis Core, but something felt different about 13. Something about the idea of just going back again and again to this world, showing us more chapters of Lightning, a character that, if we're just being completely clear, was not super loved by the community. Having so many years of this one singular character and her story, I feel like this burned a lot of fans out, because in the past, up until this point, we kept getting different cool Final Fantasy stories. Characters like Zidane and Squall. Seeing these different heroes and these different adventures was part of the thrill of it, is that every Final Fantasy, you had no idea what the heck was going to happen, but the 13 trilogy, it stuck around, and it made people say, alright, you're gonna have to wait a very long time for the next Final Fantasy. Which brings me to FF14. Now, FF14 is a very interesting proposition. It is a game that's managed to completely take over the internet very, very recently. Now, this game was always profitable, this game has always been pretty popular, but now it is completely exploded. It is just completely mainstream. Like, if you're somebody that's wanting to try out an MMORPG, most people are going to go to FF14. Now, mostly this perhaps partially comes down to the fact that this has a free trial, so it makes it where people can try it out. In fact, it's even a gigantic meme in the Final Fantasy XIV community that you should try out the MMORPG that's critically acclaimed and all the expansions and stuff. Everybody likes to say that quote over and over and over again. This is where we come to the real crux of my argument, though, which is that as fun as Final Fantasy XIV is, and as shockingly good as the writing is, because it does actually have a dedicated story that is just so top-notch, it was the first game that had an incredibly high bar of entry. And what I mean by that is cost. In order to play everything in Final Fantasy XIV, you're going to have to subscribe to the game for months and months and months. It has a $15 fee. Now, I've been subscribed for about 8 years. I've been playing the game off and on now for almost an entire decade, and I've never regretted any of it. But I understand that a lot of Final Fantasy fans could be a bit more casual. I think that people previously liked the fact that in the past, when you bought a game, you got the entire experience. Buying Final Fantasy X gave you every side quest, every ultimate weapon, every ability to fast travel, every blitzball game. It was everything on a singular disc for a singular price, and this went for every game before it. If you wanted to see everything in Final Fantasy VII, 8, 9, 1, 2, 3, each of these games was completely contained on the disc or cartridge or however you buy it. Now, to me, this isn't necessarily a detriment. I actually think that things are growing and changing. If you're going to try and have a bigger world with more you're trying to do, more side quests, more exploration, I understand that the pay model is going to change. I'm okay with this. I think that I've always been on board for the idea that video games change here and there. So if you're going to be continually trying to expand the universe of Final Fantasy, or what they're trying to do with FF14, which is completely construct a freestanding world with hundreds of millions of people logging in and out over the course of the last decade, you're going to have to do things a bit different. But here's where I think things really kind of get centered, which is Final Fantasy XV. I do believe that the major reason that people are talking about the Final Fantasy problem, the people that seem the most discontented where this series has ended up, it all comes down to FF15. Now, in general, I'm a pretty big defender of this game because I did think the story was pretty neat. I actually like the idea of having cars and guns just back to back with people who are using swords and classic sorcery. Yeah, the kids dressed a bit like an emo boy band, but still, I liked the villain Arden. I thought that it was an interesting idea, but as much as I was able to love this game, and I know a lot of fans definitely enjoyed it, I still feel like FF15 was the first game that did kind of disrespect the player itself. Now, what I mean by that is that FF15, it is the best example of what some gamers downright hate about current gaming. Like, one of the things is that if you bought an old school Final Fantasy, like say you just picked up one of the random ones, it was totally done. Like, the game was done, there was no patches, there was no updates, you just buy an old school Final Fantasy and it works perfect. But in Final Fantasy 15, it did not work like that. If you wanted to see everything in this, well, the game first and foremost started off missing huge chunks of its story, and you could only control the hero Noctis. There were these other people that you couldn't even play for the first couple years that the game was out. But then over time, they started to release this paid DLC, letting you play as the side characters, like Prompto and all these other people that he's running around with. Ignis, like these guys are so good, and these side stories were surprisingly fun. I really enjoyed actually doing it. They were fun supplements to the main story. But these extra chapters, the problem is that they are essential to the plot. And, it doesn't end here. Like, in fact, Square Enix released a tie-in movie called Kingsglaive, a prequel anime called Brotherhood, a side-scrolling beat-em-up for Final Fantasy XV, and a novel that explains the unfinished story that they wanted to do for the villain Arden. Do you know how I know that? Because I read it. Like, I'm serious, let me grab this. I have it right here. I actually tracked down the Final Fantasy XV book, which has all this concept art and stuff in it. Like, it is wild to me that they expected people are going to do all of this for the singular story of FF15. You know what? I'm not even talking about the fact that there's a VR game, which is like a VR fishing game set in the Final Fantasy XV universe. There's a cell phone rendition of this that actually looks like crap. This is also technically a canon chunk of the Final Fantasy XV universe. And to me, I feel like it's actually showing fans that in order to see everything, you have to keep swiping your credit card. Now, I know that later on they released the Royal Edition with a bunch of the stuff packaged in, and if you play the games now, I actually think they're pretty damn perfect and complete. My issue is that this is what's turning off the newer fans. Like, the higher the bar of entry, the more you're going to just turn people off, because let's just face facts. Most people, when they want to play video games, they're looking for the easiest, funnest experience. Not just easy and difficulty, but what I mean is that when people get off work, they want to be able to sit down with their controller, turn something on, and instantaneously have fun, whether that is the dramatic, sad tales of FF7, or even things like the gigantic, grand stories that we see in the later experiences. I feel like over time, it seems like Square Enix has become more centered on the idea of how can we milk the fan base instead of giving them the best product right up front. Now, I'm going to say something a bit controversial here. I've noticed a bit of this angry discourse about the Final Fantasy VII Remake, and part of it comes down to the fact that it seems like we're not going to see these games completed for a very, very long time. FF7 Remake Part 1 was incredibly fun. I loved the new combat. I loved the additional chapters to the story. It's such a deep dive look at Midgar, this haunted city, eternally shrouded in shade. Like, FF7 Remake, I gave it a 9.5 out of 10 when I reviewed it, and I completely stand by that. It is such a top-notch experience. But recently, we got this new piece of DLC, playing as Yuffie, exploring Midgar as well, and it's starting to make people think, how long is it going to take to do the Final Fantasy VII Remake? Because Remake Part 1 was a tiny sliver of the bigger universe. Now let's just say that it's 2 or 3 years for each chunk of the Final Fantasy VII Remake, which for Square Enix timelines, this is being pretty generous. Usually their games take a very long time to make, but let's just assume that it's going to be 2 or 3 years for each of the games. That means it's probably going to be about a decade, a full 10 years to see everything in this new Final Fantasy VII Remake series, which to me, that's still assuming it's going to be 3 games, maybe it'll be 5 games, maybe there's going to be prequels and sequels that do Dirge of Cerberus and Crisis Core all over again, which back in the day were the original sequel and prequel. And my thought is that as cool as this is to me, as a mega fan, I feel like this is, again, such a high bar of entry to casual fans. From the very, very start, the true appeal of Final Fantasy in general has just been the incredibly high quality touch to every experience. So even if you are playing the weird stuff like some of the sequels that people have forgotten about, like 12.2, or even things like the rhythm game, Theater Rhythm, I feel like each Final Fantasy game has a purpose. There is these lovely fingerprints on every single project where you can tell that people care about it. Every game is built to be a great experience, and I feel like the series still manages to do that. A lot of these games coming out are still very, very good, but I feel like as we start to get more of these spin-offs, every year we're getting things like Final Fantasy World, which is like Final Fantasy Pokemon, Final Fantasy Explorers, which was basically FF Monster Hunter. Each of these things, as fun as they still are to play, I feel like it's creating this watering down of the original vision. I feel like people saying that Final Fantasy are dead are going way too far, but additionally, Final Fantasy is not what it used to be. Final Fantasy has changed. Now that we're about to get Final Fantasy Origin, which is like Final Fantasy Dark Souls, it feels like things are just going to continue just expanding in every direction. So what I want to say is this. I'm still completely happy with this series. I'm still very thrilled to be a fan of this ongoing weirdness that continues to evolve. But I still feel like the quality has gone down, on average, from a series that used to just create 10 out of 10 bangers back to back. Final Fantasy IX, Final Fantasy X, these are some of the best RPGs ever created. I feel like nothing is going to be able to top some of those incredible plot twists, those crazy times of finishing off a side quest and getting a god item. These were just so incredibly good. I feel like nothing is really going to be able to rival that. But even still, I'm too curious about what comes next. Are we getting some garbage out there? Yeah, a little bit. Are we getting more good games? There's some good stuff in the pipe. But I just want to say, as bad as some of the worst Final Fantasies have been, I can't help but be optimistic. I'm still excited for Final Fantasy XVI, whatever the heck that game turns into. I'm still excited for the next expansion of Final Fantasy XIV, which is Endwalker. I'm still completely ready for the future of Final Fantasy. Good, bad, or ugly, I'm just excited to be along for the ride. But what do you think? These are just kind of some thoughts, because I just love classic Final Fantasy. I've been going back through a bunch of the old games recently, and those old games are just still such masterpieces. And I respect how much they've managed to build, and how well they've managed to age, because a lot of games completely suck after a couple years, but those classic experiences seriously stand the test of time, which to me is just another testament of how good they were, and how good they still are. Instead of claiming that Final Fantasy is dead, celebrate what you love. Go back, play those games again. They're still there. They're still playable. You can still track them down and enjoy them for yourself. But additionally, if you're one of those people like me that wants to see what the heck is coming next, join me on this adventure to see what's coming next in Final Fantasy. Thanks so much for watching, gamers. This has been DreamcastGuy, also known as Max Shockley. I just wanted to do a more personal video because I love Final Fantasy, and this is a topic I very much wanted to talk about. I love you guys very much. Thanks for watching, and please give this video a like, leave me a comment, and keep dreaming. And also, give me another trailer for Final Fantasy VII Remake. Thanks so much for watching that video. If you want to see something else, you can always click this link to see what I put up last, or, subscribe and see what's coming up next. Also, I promise that whatever I do, it'll try not to suck.